I didn't plan to write this, but after what happened, I feel like I have to. Maybe it will help someone, or maybe it will just help me to understand what went wrong. But whatever it is, I need to get it out. We were just supposed to have a fun weekend, you know? Me, Tom, Jess, and Mark, best friends since high school, we thought a camping trip would be a good way to relive the old days. We packed our stuff and drove out to a forest we had been to before, a place we knew was quiet and far from the city. It was just what we needed. The first day went as expected. We set up camp, made a fire, and talked about everything and nothing. We laughed about how stupid we were back in the day, shared some drinks, and felt like we were invincible again, like nothing could go wrong. The forest was calm and the air was fresh. I don't think any of us even thought twice about where we were or what could happen. We were just there, in the moment, feeling free. The next morning, after a simple breakfast, Tom suggested we explore the area a bit. We had been to this forest before, but we never really ventured far from the main trails. This time, we decided to see what else was out there. It didn't take long before we found a narrow path hidden behind some thick bushes. It was strange because it wasn't on the map we had. Tom, being Tom, was excited, and he convinced the rest of us to follow it. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to be the one who ruined the fun. The trail was rough and not well trodden, like it hadn't been used in years. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt, but I didn't say anything. I could tell Jess wasn't feeling it either. She kept looking over her shoulder like she was expecting someone to be there, but no one was. We just kept walking. After what felt like hours, we came across an old cabin, hidden so well by the trees that you could easily miss it if you weren't paying attention. The place was falling apart with broken windows and a door barely hanging on its hinges. But what caught my eye was the thin line of smoke coming from the chimney. It was faint, but it was there. Someone had been here, maybe even still was. Tom wanted to check it out, of course. Mark was on board too. Jess and I hesitated, but we followed. Inside, the place was a mess, covered in dust and spider webs, like no one had lived there in years. But there were strange things that didn't fit. Fresh food in the pantry, a candle still burning on the table, and, most disturbing of all, a notebook lying open with our names written in it. Our names and the times we had done things since we arrived at the campsite. The air felt heavy, like we were being watched, and we all realized at the same time that we needed to leave. Now. But when we got back to the campsite, something was wrong. Our car keys were gone, all of them, like they had just vanished. Panic started to set in. We argued, tried to figure out what to do, but no one had any good ideas. We were stuck. As night began to fall, the forest that had seemed so peaceful just a day ago now felt like a trap. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made us jump. We tried to stay calm, but it wasn't easy. We thought about staying in the cabin, locking ourselves in until morning, but the idea of being inside that place, knowing someone had been there, watching us, was too much. Then, as the last light faded, we heard it. The sound of footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, like whoever was out there wanted us to know they were there. We killed the lights and huddled together, listening, hoping it was just our imagination. But the footsteps kept going, circling the cabin, getting closer. We bolted. I don't even remember who started running first, but suddenly we were all sprinting through the trees, not caring about direction, just wanting to get away. The forest was pitch black, and the branches clawed at us as we ran. It wasn't long before I lost sight of the others. I called out, but there was no answer, just the sound of my own breathing. And somewhere, the crunch of leaves under heavy footsteps. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. My legs were burning and my chest felt like it was going to explode, but I couldn't stop. I felt like if I stopped, I wouldn't make it out. But then, just as suddenly as I had started running, I found myself at the edge of the forest. The trees parted, and there was the road just a few steps away. I had made it. But as I took those last steps, something made me turn around. And there, just beyond the tree line, I saw it. Someone standing there, watching me. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they had been the one following us, hunting us. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I ran to the road and kept running until I found help. They found the others the next day. Jess and Mark were fine, shaken up, but okay. But Tom, they never found Tom. They say he probably got lost, that he's still out there somewhere. But I know better. I know that whoever was in that forest got him. And I know that they're still out there, watching, waiting for their next chance. I haven't gone back to the forest since, and I don't think I ever will. But I can't stop thinking about it, about what happened and what could have happened. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I still feel like I'm being watched, like someone is out there, just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting. I was so excited for this trip. My first solo camping adventure. Just me, my tent, and the quiet of the forest. I wanted to disconnect from the world for a few days, to find some peace in nature. I'd been planning this for months, reading up on the best places to camp, making sure I had all the gear I needed. I even picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any road or other campers. I needed the solitude. The first day went just as planned. I hiked to the spot I'd chosen, set up my tent, and made a small fire. The forest was calm, almost too calm, but I liked it. I cooked a simple meal, listened to the sounds of the trees rustling in the wind, and watched the sky darken as night came. Everything was perfect. I felt safe, at peace. That night, though, I woke up to a sound outside the tent. It was like something moving through the bushes, just outside. I held my breath and listened, trying to figure out what it was. Probably just an animal, I thought, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I didn't want to scare myself over nothing, so I forced myself to relax and go back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I knew something was wrong. My camp was a mess. My tent was slashed open, my things were scattered everywhere, and my food was torn apart, like someone, or something, had gone through it all. Panic gripped me. Who could have done this? An animal wouldn't make this kind of mess. It looked too deliberate, too targeted. My mind raced, trying to find a reasonable explanation, but nothing made sense. I reached for my phone to call for help, but, of course, there was no signal out here. I was miles from the nearest road, cut off from everything. The nearest town was a full day's hike away, and I had no way to reach anyone. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I just needed to pack up and get out of here. But as I started to gather my things, I noticed something else. Footprints. Human footprints circling my camp. They weren't mine. Someone had been here during the night, watching me, maybe even while I was asleep. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I wasn't alone in these woods. Someone was out here with me, and they knew these woods better than I did. I started walking, trying to retrace my steps back to the trail, but every noise made me jump. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was following me. But every time I looked back, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. My mind was playing tricks on me, or maybe it wasn't. I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. As the day went on, the signs became more obvious. Broken branches, disturbed earth, more footprints. They were getting closer, following me. whoever it was, they were toying with me, letting me know they were there without showing themselves. I tried calling out, hoping maybe it was someone who could help, but there was no answer, only silence. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. By the time the sun started to set, I was desperate. I hadn't eaten all day, my water was running low, and I was exhausted from hiking through the dense forest. I knew I couldn't keep going much longer, so I decided to set up camp again, hoping to get some rest and start fresh in the morning. But deep down, I knew it was a bad idea. I was too scared to stop, but too tired to keep going. That night was worse than the first. I barely slept, listening to every sound, every movement outside the tent. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to a hand covering my mouth, the cold blade of a knife pressed against my throat. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could think was that I was going to die out here, alone in the woods, and no one would ever find me. But then, just as suddenly as it had happened, the hand was gone. I scrambled out of the tent, my hands shaking, and ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get away. My only thought was to put as much distance between me and whoever that was. My legs felt like lead, and every step was agony, but I kept going, driven by pure terror. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I couldn't go any further. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. I couldn't hear anything around me, no footsteps, no voices. Maybe I'd lost them. Maybe I was safe, but I knew better than to believe that. They were still out there, somewhere, watching me, waiting. The next morning, I found a road. I don't know how I got there, but the relief I felt was overwhelming. I flagged down the first car that passed, and the driver, seeing the state I was in, immediately took me to the nearest town. I didn't tell them what had happened, didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But even now, safe in my home, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I keep seeing those footprints in my mind, hearing the rustle of the bushes at night. I know they're still out there, in those woods, waiting for their next victim. And sometimes, I wonder if they'll come for me again. Because if they know the woods that well, maybe they know where I live too. When we decided to go camping at the lake, it seemed like the perfect idea. The four of us, me, Jake, Laura, and Sam, had been planning a weekend getaway for months. We were looking forward to escaping the city and the noise. Jake knew of this remote lake, deep in the woods, far from any towns. He said it was the perfect place, secluded and quiet. It sounded perfect. The drive was long, the roads turning from highways to narrow dirt paths that seemed to lead to nowhere. Finally, we reached the lake. It was beautiful, surrounded by thick trees with the water so still it looked like glass. There was something odd about the stillness, though. It felt almost too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. But we didn't think much of it. We were excited to set up camp and start our weekend. The first day was great. We set up our tents, cooked by the fire, and told stories. The silence that surrounded us felt peaceful at first, a welcome break from our usual busy lives. But as the sun began to set, I noticed how the quiet started to feel heavy, almost oppressive. The lake's stillness wasn't calming anymore. It felt like it was hiding something. The next morning, Jake and I decided to explore the lakeshore while Laura and Sam stayed back at the camp. We walked along the water, throwing rocks and chatting. That's when Jake spotted something shiny under the surface. It was strange because the lake was so clear, but this object was deep, and we couldn't see it well. Curiosity got the better of us. Jake stripped off his shirt and waded into the water. I watched as he dove down, disappearing beneath the surface. When he came back up, his face was pale, and he looked shocked. "It's a car," he said. almost in a whisper. "There's a car down there, and I think there's someone inside." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. A car, submerged in this quiet lake? It didn't make sense. We both stood there for a moment, frozen, not knowing what to do. Then reality hit us. Someone was dead, trapped in that car. We ran back to the camp and told Laura and Sam. They didn't believe us at first, thought we were joking. But when they saw how serious we were, their faces changed. We all rushed to the spot. Sam stayed on the shore while Jake, Laura, and I went into the water. Jake dove down again, this time with Laura beside him. When they resurfaced, Laura was crying, and Jake looked like he was about to be sick. "It's real," he said. "There's a body in there. It's been there a long time." We all panicked. The first thought was to call the police, but when we grabbed our phones, there was no signal. Nothing. We tried moving around, climbing onto rocks, but it was useless. We were completely cut off. The realization of how isolated we were started to sink in. There was no one around, no help for miles. "What do we do?" Laura kept asking, her voice trembling. No one had an answer. The day that started so well was now a nightmare. We decided to leave immediately. There was no way we could stay after what we found. We started packing up our things in a rush, not talking much, just moving quickly. That's when we saw him. A man standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong there. His clothes were dirty, his hair unkempt, and there was something unsettling about his eyes. He just stood there, staring at us. Jake was the first to speak. "Hey, do you need something?" he called out. The man didn't answer right away. He took a few steps forward, his eyes locked on us. "You found the car, didn't you?" the man finally said, his voice calm but somehow threatening. We all froze. How could he know? We hadn't seen anyone else the whole time we were there. "What do you know about the car?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You shouldn't have found it. You shouldn't be here." The way he said it made my blood run cold. It was clear that this wasn't just a warning. There was something much darker behind his words. We started to back away, trying to keep calm, but the fear was building up inside me. "We're leaving now," I said, hoping he would just let us go. But he shook his head slowly. "No, you're not." That's when the panic truly set in. We grabbed our things and made a run for it, heading toward the car. I could hear Laura sobbing behind me, and Sam was trying to calm her down, but we were all terrified. We could hear the man following us, his footsteps quick and deliberate. He was close, too close. The path back to the car felt longer than before, like the woods were stretching out to keep us there. Every sound, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept looking back, expecting to see him right behind us, but he was never in sight. It was like he was toying with us, letting us think we could get away. When we finally reached the car, we were out of breath and on the edge of hysteria. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. But when he tried to start the car, it wouldn't turn over. The engine was dead. "What the hell?" Jake yelled, trying again and again, but it was no use. The car wasn't going anywhere. We all turned around at the same time, and there he was, standing at the edge of the trees, that same creepy smile on his face. He started walking toward us, slowly, confidently. And that's where the story ends. I don't know what happened next. My memory is a blur after that point, and the police reports don't help much. But they never found the man. They said the car must have been tampered with. They didn't find the body in the lake either. It was like everything had just disappeared. All I know is I'm never going back to that lake again. I never wanted to go camping, not like this. We thought it would help us, Bring us closer after all the fights, the cold silences. The idea was simple. A weekend in the woods, away from everything and everyone. Just us. I thought it was a good idea too. I was wrong. We drove for hours, the car bouncing on the rough dirt road that led deep into the forest. There were no other cars, no other people, just trees, tall and thick, closing in on us as we went further. I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach. This was supposed to be good for us, for our relationship. It was supposed to help. We found a spot, a small clearing surrounded by trees so thick they blocked out most of the light. It was quiet, too quiet, but she liked it, said it was perfect. We set up the tent, unpacked our things, and tried to relax. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, never left me. As the sun started to set, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. It wasn't just the isolation. It was something more, something darker. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The first night, it began. We were sitting by the fire, the flames flickering weakly in the cold air. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. And then there was a sound, a rustling in the trees. She heard it too. We both froze, listening. It was probably just an animal, I told myself, but the rustling didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. Then it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. I tried to joke, to ease the tension. Maybe it's Bigfoot, I said, but my voice shook. She didn't laugh. Neither did I. We sat there staring into the darkness beyond the fire's light, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The footsteps stopped, and eventually, we went to bed, though neither of us slept much. The next day, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. When we stepped out of the tent in the morning, we found footprints in the dirt around our campsite. They weren't ours. They were too big. And there were too many of them, circling around the tent in a pattern that made my skin crawl. Maybe we should leave, I suggested, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. She disagreed, said we were overreacting, but I could see the fear in her eyes too. We argued. It was like all the tension from before the trip had come back. Only now it was mixed with something else, something darker. I wanted to leave, but she insisted we stay, said it would be fine, that we were just scaring ourselves. I didn't believe her, but I didn't want to fight anymore, so I agreed. We spent the day trying to enjoy ourselves, but every sound, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. That night, the real horror began. We were lying in the tent, the darkness outside pressing in on us. I couldn't sleep, my ears straining to hear any sound. Then, I heard it. Breathing. Slow, deep breathing, right outside the tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, listening. The breathing grew louder, closer. I reached for the knife we had brought, my hand shaking. She was awake too. I could feel her tense beside me. The zipper of the tent began to move, slowly, almost hesitantly. My breath caught in my throat. I knew then that we were not alone, that whoever or whatever was out there had been watching us, waiting. I didn't think. I just acted. As the zipper reached the bottom, I lunged forward, knife in hand, and slashed at the figure entering the tent. There was a grunt, a curse, and then a struggle. I fought with everything I had, but the figure was strong, stronger than me. I felt the cold air rush in as we tumbled out of the tent, rolling on the ground, the knife slipping from my grasp. I could hear her screaming, but it was like a distant sound, like it was happening somewhere far away. All I could focus on was the man. Yes, it was a man. His face wild, his eyes crazed, as he tried to overpower me. He smelled of dirt, sweat, and something else, something rotten. I could barely see him in the darkness, but I could feel his strength, his desperation. Finally, with a burst of adrenaline, I managed to push him off me, kicking him as hard as I could. He stumbled back, and I scrambled to my feet, grabbing her hand and running. We ran through the forest, not knowing where we were going, just running. The trees closed in around us, the branches clawing at our clothes, our skin. But we didn't stop. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor, gasping for breath. We could still hear him, crashing through the woods behind us. But we didn't stop. We got up and kept running, our fear pushing us forward, until we finally saw lights, a road. We stumbled onto it, nearly collapsing again, but a car stopped, and we were saved. The authorities found the man's camp the next day. He had been living in the woods for years, surviving off the land and attacking anyone who came too close. They found signs that he had been watching us for days before we even realized we were being hunted. They never caught him. He disappeared into the woods, leaving only the terror he had inflicted on us. We made it out, but we were never the same. Every time I close my eyes, I still see him, still hear that zipper slowly opening. I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting for his next victims. I'm not sure why I'm writing this down. Maybe it's because I need to get it out of my head, or maybe because I'm scared, really scared. But I think it's important to say this before it's too late. Last weekend, a group of us decided to go camping. We wanted to get away from the city, disconnect from everything for a bit. It was me, Jess, Mike, and Lena. We found this campsite online, somewhere deep in the woods, miles away from any town. It sounded perfect at first, but when we got there, something felt off. The trees were too tall, blocking out most of the sunlight, and there was this heavy silence that made me uneasy right from the start. The others didn't seem to notice. They were laughing, excited to start the weekend. We set up our tents close to an old fire pit, probably left by the last campers. Mike was the one who found it, the notebook. It was half buried near the fire pit, almost like someone tried to get rid of it but couldn't. "Hey, look at this," Mike said, holding up the worn-out book. The cover was dirty, the pages yellowed with age. He opened it, flipping through the pages with a grin. Someone left their diary behind. The writing inside was messy, like it had been written in a hurry, and as Mike read aloud, the smile slowly faded from his face. The words were all over the place, describing strange noises, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, and a feeling of being watched. The writer sounded desperate, terrified. Jess laughed it off, saying it was probably some creative writer messing around. Lena agreed, though she looked a bit uneasy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the person who wrote those words wasn't joking. There was something about the way the words were written, the fear in them that felt too real. We decided to keep the notebook, a weird souvenir from our trip, and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. That night, as we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about nothing in particular, I kept glancing at the trees. They were so tall, so dark. It felt like they were closing in on us, trapping us in this tiny clearing. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made me jump. The next day, things got worse. I started noticing things, little things. A whisper on the wind that wasn't quite the wind. A shadow that flickered just out of the corner of my eye. I tried to tell the others, but they just laughed, saying I was being paranoid. But I knew what I heard, what I saw. Mike thought it would be funny to read more of the notebook, but as he did, I could see the color draining from his face. The writer had started to describe something else, something that was getting closer. They could hear it at night, heavy footsteps circling the campsite, but whenever they looked, There was nothing there. The writer kept saying they couldn't escape. No matter how fast they ran, it was always right behind them. I could feel my heart racing as Mike read. I didn't want to hear any more, but I couldn't make him stop. The fear in the words was contagious, spreading through me like a virus. And then, just like that, the tension snapped. Lena and Jess started arguing about something. I don't even remember what. But the tension was thick, like a rope pulled too tight. We all snapped at each other, the stress of the place getting to us. The campsite that had seemed so perfect was now a prison, and we were trapped inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made my skin crawl. The wind howling through the trees, the creak of the branches, even the crackling of the fire felt wrong, like it was too loud, too close. I kept thinking about those footsteps the writer mentioned, the ones they couldn't escape, and then I heard them. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sound was too real, too solid. Slow, heavy footsteps moving around the campsite, just beyond the firelight. I held my breath, listening, hoping it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I shook Mike awake, trying to tell him what I heard, but he just rolled over, mumbling something about it being nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I knew that. I got up, moving closer to the edge of the camp, trying to see into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just shadows and trees. But the footsteps didn't stop. And then I found the note. It was lying by the fire pit, fresh ink on the yellowed page. My hands shook as I picked it up, reading the words, each one making my heart pound harder. It was my name, my exact situation written down, as if the writer had been watching me all along, and it ended with the words, "It's here." I dropped the note, stumbling back, my mind racing. It was impossible, but there it was, right in front of me. I turned to wake the others, but they were gone. Their tents were there, but they were empty. Panic surged through me, and I started to run, the footsteps now right behind me, faster, louder. I ran through the woods, branches scratching at my skin, roots tripping me up, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The footsteps were so close I could almost feel the breath on my neck. But no matter how fast I ran, it was always there, always right behind me. I don't remember how long I ran, but when I finally stopped, I was alone, deep in the forest, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The footsteps were gone, but the silence was worse. I don't know if I escaped or if I'm still running, trapped in this nightmare. I'm writing this now, trying to make sense of it all, but I can't. All I know is that I'm scared, and I don't think I'm ever going to stop running. Maybe if I stop, it'll catch up to me. I went camping alone to get away from everything. The city, the noise, the stress. It was all too much. I thought a few nights in the woods would clear my head. The spot I chose was perfect, remote, peaceful, just me and nature. I could hear nothing but crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The isolation felt comforting, like a blanket of silence wrapping around me. I felt at peace for the first time in months. As I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, I let my mind wander. I was completely relaxed, feeling a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. The crackling fire was soothing, and the night was cool, but not cold. It was everything I needed. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was a piercing, blood-curdling sound that made my heart stop. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that maybe it was just an animal or some trick of the wind. But then I heard it again, louder this time, closer. My heart started racing, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I was out here all alone, miles from anyone. The scream was so intense, so full of fear, that it sent chills down my spine. I wanted to stay in the safety of my tent, but what if someone was in real danger? What if they needed help? Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and headed in the direction of the scream. My hands were shaking, and every step felt heavier than the last. The night seemed darker now, the trees more menacing, as if they were closing in on me. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it didn't do much to calm my nerves. As I walked, I kept telling myself that I was doing the right thing, that someone could be hurt and that I needed to help. But a small voice in the back of my mind kept asking, what if it's a trap? I tried to push the thought away, but it kept creeping back, gnawing at my resolve. The screams had stopped by the time I reached a clearing. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie light over everything. My flashlight caught something on the ground, and my heart sank. It was a body, twisted and broken, lying motionless in the grass. Blood pooled around it, dark and thick, and the sight made me gag. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was worse than any nightmare. I stood there, frozen, unable to move or think. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the horror in front of me. But before I could do anything, I heard a sound, a soft rustle behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. My blood ran cold. It was the killer, and they were coming for me. Panic took over, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The forest was a maze, the trees all looking the same, and I could hear the footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in pain, but I didn't dare stop. The terror kept me moving, kept me running. I stumbled through the underbrush, branches slapping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear the killer behind me, their breath ragged, their footsteps heavy. The darkness seemed to be closing in, the trees growing thicker, as if the forest itself was trying to trap me. Just when I thought I might have lost them, I tripped. I went down hard, hitting the ground with a thud that knocked the wind out of me. I scrambled to get up, but my foot was caught on something, a root, a rock, I couldn't tell. Panic surged through me as I tugged and pulled, desperate to free myself. And then they were there, standing over me, their shadow looming like a death sentence. I could feel the fear clawing at my throat, choking me. But instead of attacking, they leaned down, their face close to mine. I could see their eyes, cold and empty, like a predator looking at its prey. They whispered something, so quiet I almost didn't hear it, but the words sent a chill through my entire body. I've been waiting for you. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't random. This wasn't just bad luck. They had been waiting for me. I was the target all along. My mind reeled, trying to understand. But there was no time. No time to think. No time to react. All I could do was scream, a scream that echoed through the forest, mixing with the distant sounds of the night. And then, nothing. Just darkness. I don't know what happened next. I don't remember how it ended, or if it even did. All I know is that when I woke up, I was back at my campsite, the fire burnt out, the sun rising in the sky. Everything was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But the fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to come back. I packed up and left that morning, not daring to stay another second in those woods. But the memory of that night haunts me. The sound of those screams, the sight of that body, the feeling of being hunted. I don't know who that killer was or why they chose me, but I do know one thing. I'll never go camping alone again. I needed a break. Life had been too noisy, too busy, and I wanted to be alone, away from everything. I packed my gear and drove into the mountains, following a trail that most people avoided. I wasn't looking for comfort. I wanted solitude. And that's what I found when I came across an old, abandoned mine deep in the woods. The air was cooler there, and the silence was exactly what I needed. It was the perfect place to set up camp, or so I thought. The mine's entrance was a dark hole in the side of a hill, half covered by overgrown bushes. It looked like it had been untouched for years, maybe decades. As the sun started to set, I watched shadows stretch across the ground, making the place seem even more isolated. I didn't mind the silence, but as the light faded, I began to feel the weight of it pressing down on me. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, grew eerily still. I shrugged it off, telling myself I needed to relax. The first sign that something wasn't right came when I was lying in my tent, trying to sleep. At first, it was just a faint sound, like someone or something was moving around near the mine. It was hard to tell exactly where it was coming from, but it was close, too close. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. My heart started to race as I strained to listen, every nerve on edge. I didn't want to, but I had to see what was making that noise. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The trees stood tall and still, their branches like skeletal arms reaching up to the sky. I pointed the light towards the mine, the beam shaking slightly in my hand. For a moment, everything was quiet again, but then I heard it. A shuffling sound, definitely coming from inside the mine. My curiosity was stronger than my fear. I couldn't just ignore it, so I walked slowly towards the mine's entrance. The light from my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness inside. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the dirt, fresh and leading straight into the mine. They were too big to be from an animal, and there was only one set. Someone had been here recently, maybe was still here now. I stood there, trying to decide what to do. The smart thing would have been to turn around, pack up my things, and get the hell out of there. But I didn't. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I was scared. So, I stepped inside. The air inside the mine was thick, almost suffocating. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper, making the shadows jump around me. The walls were damp and covered in old, rotting wood. I kept walking, the footprints guiding me, until I reached a spot where the tunnel widened into a small chamber. That's when I saw it, a makeshift bed, a pile of dirty blankets, and scattered around it, old tools, empty cans, and food wrappers. Someone had been living here. My stomach twisted in fear. I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I suddenly felt very vulnerable. The noises started up again, louder this time, coming from somewhere deeper in the mine. My pulse quickened as I tried to backtrack, but my legs felt like they were moving through mud. I had to get out, but something was holding me back, something that felt like pure dread. Then I heard a voice. It was low, almost a growl coming from the darkness ahead. "You shouldn't be here," it said. The words were slow, deliberate, and filled with menace. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. At first, it was hard to make out their features, but as they stepped into the dim light, I saw enough to know that I was in serious danger. The person, if they were still fully human, looked gaunt, their clothes hanging off them like they hadn't eaten properly in a long time. but it was their eyes that terrified me the most. Cold, empty, and focused entirely on me. "I need to go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could hear the tremor in it. I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. They just stood there, watching me, as if deciding what to do next. Then they spoke again, their voice a whisper this time, almost gentle. "You can't leave." Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I scrambled to find the way out. I could hear the figure's footsteps behind me, slow and measured, as if they knew there was no rush. They were toying with me, letting me think I had a chance. I stumbled over rocks and debris, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The mine's entrance was just ahead, but when I reached it, I skidded to a stop. The figure was there, standing in the opening, blocking my escape. They were impossibly fast, or maybe I had been too slow. I couldn't tell anymore. Desperation took over, and I darted to the side, hoping to find another way out. The walls of the mine seemed to close in around me, the darkness almost swallowing me whole. I could hear the figure's footsteps again, closer this time, their pace quickening. I was running out of options, and I knew it. The last thing I remember is the sound of my own breathing, loud and panicked, and the figure's hand reaching out towards me as everything went black. That's where the story ends, and I wish I could say it's because I made it out and just can't bring myself to finish. But the truth is, I don't know how it ends because I'm still here, somewhere deep in that mine, trying to find a way out. Every time I think I'm close, I hear those footsteps behind me, steady and relentless, reminding me that I'll never leave this place. I don't know why we didn't listen to the locals. Maybe it was the way they said it, all serious and old-fashioned, like they were telling a ghost story to scare some kids. Or maybe it was because we were just too eager to get away from everything, to have our own little adventure. Either way, we laughed it off and drove deeper into the woods, ignoring the warnings that kept replaying in my head like a broken record. The camping spot was as beautiful as we'd imagined, secluded, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out the sun just enough to keep it cool but still bright. We set up our tents, cracked open some beers, and started a fire. It was perfect, or at least it was supposed to be. That first night, things started to feel off. I remember looking for my flashlight, which I was sure I had left by the tent, but it was gone. Nobody owned up to taking it, but we all assumed it was just one of us messing around. We laughed about it, though it felt a little forced. Then, the weird noises started. They weren't loud, just the kind of sounds you can almost convince yourself are normal. A twig snapping, a rustle in the leaves, a faint whisper of movement just out of sight. Someone joked it was just the wind, but the uneasy feeling in my gut said otherwise. The next morning, we found the symbols. They were carved into the trees around our campsite, crude and unsettling. Circles, triangles, lines that didn't make any sense. We all tried to laugh it off again, but the laughter was thin, hollow. Tom, the guy who'd organized the trip, said it was probably some teenagers who'd camped here before us, trying to freak people out. That made sense, I guess. But the way those symbols were carved, they looked fresh, like someone had done it while we were sleeping. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but every time I glanced into the trees, I thought I saw movement just at the edge of my vision. I didn't say anything, though. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the trip with my crazy talk. It wasn't until later that afternoon that things really started to spiral. We found footprints around our campsite that weren't ours. They were small, like a child's, but the depth of the prints suggested someone heavier. There were no kids with us, obviously, and no other campers around for miles. That's when it hit me. We weren't alone. I started putting the pieces together, the symbols, the missing items, the strange noises at night. We had walked right into someone else's territory, and whoever it was, they weren't happy about it. I tried to tell the others, but by then, the sun was setting, and panic was setting in. We decided to pack up and leave, but as we started to gather our things, we saw them, shadows in the trees, barely visible, but definitely there. They were watching us. We froze, not sure if we should run or stay. Then Tom, always the brave one, shouted for them to show themselves. Nothing happened for a few heartbeats, and then, all at once, they stepped out from behind the trees. There were at least a dozen of them, dressed in dark clothes, faces obscured by hoods. They didn't say anything, just stood there, blocking our way. I could feel the fear rising in my throat, choking me. Someone whispered that we needed to go, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped. That's when everything fell apart. Someone screamed, and we all bolted in different directions. I don't know why I ran the way I did. Maybe I was just trying to get away from the others, hoping I could find a path out of the woods. But the deeper I went, the darker it got. And soon I was lost, completely alone. I could hear them behind me. Those soft footsteps crunching leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. They weren't running. They didn't need to. They knew these woods better than I did, and they were just waiting for me to tire out, to make a mistake. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them right behind me, but all I saw were shadows. Eventually, I stumbled onto a path. I don't know how I found it, but I knew it had to lead somewhere. I just kept running, pushing myself harder even though my legs were screaming at me to stop. The path started to look familiar, like one we had passed earlier in the day. Maybe, just maybe, I was heading back to the car. But with every step, that hope started to die. The path didn't lead to the car. It led deeper into the woods, into a part that felt wrong, ancient, like it wasn't meant for people like me. The footsteps were closer now, and I knew I couldn't keep going. My body was giving up. My mind was on the edge of breaking. I collapsed on the side of the path, trying to catch my breath. But all I could think about was how stupid we had been, how we had ignored every sign, every warning. I could hear them all around me now, moving through the trees like predators stalking prey. I didn't want to die, but I knew there was no way out. I heard a voice then, a whisper so close it felt like it was inside my head. It said my name, soft and slow, drawing out the syllables like it was savoring them. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it just kept repeating, getting louder and louder until it was all I could hear. And then, nothing. Silence. I opened my eyes and they were gone. The path was empty, the woods quiet again, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew they were still out there, waiting for me to move, to make a sound. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally stood up, the sun was just starting to rise. The woods looked different in the daylight, less threatening, but I knew that was a lie. I started walking again, slowly this time, back the way I had come. I didn't see any more shadows, didn't hear any more footsteps, but I knew they were there, watching me, waiting. I don't know how I made it back to the campsite, but when I did, it was empty. No tents, no sign of the others, just the symbols carved into the trees, mocking me. I didn't stop to look for them. I just ran, straight to the car. When I got there, I found the keys in the ignition, like someone had left them for me. I don't remember driving back to town. I just remember the feeling of those eyes on me the whole way, and the certainty that they weren't done with me yet. I'm still not sure what happened to the others. I've gone back to that spot a few times, but there's nothing left. No signs, no symbols, no bodies. Just the silence of the woods, waiting for the next group of idiots to wander in. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip. My friend Tom and I had planned it for weeks. A weekend of camping deep in the woods, away from the city noise and stress. We were both looking forward to it, imagining the calm nights under the stars and the smell of pine trees. We set up our tent by a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The first night was perfect. We sat by the campfire, telling stories, laughing and enjoying the silence of nature. There was something comforting about being out there, away from everything, or at least, that's what I thought at the time. I woke up early the next morning, the light of dawn just beginning to filter through the trees. For a moment, I didn't realize what was wrong. The tent was quiet, too quiet. I turned to where Tom should have been, but his sleeping bag was empty. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I crawled out of the tent, my hands shaking as I searched the area around our camp. That's when I saw it, the trail of blood. It was smeared on the ground, leading away from the tent, disappearing into the thick woods. My mind raced with thoughts I didn't want to consider. Tom had to be hurt, but how? What had happened during the night? I hadn't heard anything, no screams, no struggle. But the blood was there, fresh and real. I didn't think twice. I grabbed the flashlight and started following the trail. The sun was just rising, but the forest was still dark, the trees casting long shadows that made everything look sinister. The blood trail was clear at first, bright red against the dirt and fallen leaves, but as I went deeper it became harder to follow. The ground was rough, branches and rocks making it difficult to keep my footing. I stumbled several times, each time feeling like I was losing precious minutes. My fear grew with every step, a cold dread settling in my stomach. I called out Tom's name again, but only the silence of the forest answered me. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. That's when I started to notice the other signs. Broken branches, scattered pieces of Tom's belongings, his hat, his phone, lying abandoned on the ground. There had been a struggle here, that much was clear. But where was Tom? And why hadn't I heard anything during the night? As I kept going, I began to feel like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling, like eyes were following me, hiding in the shadows between the trees. I stopped several times, shining the flashlight around, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything. But there was nothing. Just the dark, endless forest, and the blood trail that was slowly fading. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found the pit. It was a deep hole in the ground, hidden by leaves and branches. I almost fell into it before I saw it, and inside was Tom. He was alive, but just barely. He looked up at me, his face pale and bloody, his eyes wide with fear. I dropped to my knees, reaching down to try and pull him out. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a man standing in the shadows, just beyond the pit. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that blended in with the forest. His face was hidden, but I could see the gleam of his eyes, watching me, waiting. I froze, my hands still gripping the edge of the pit. The man didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, like he was enjoying the show. I had to get Tom out of there. I couldn't leave him. I reached down again, this time with more urgency, trying to pull him up. But Tom was weak, barely able to move. The man in the shadows took a step forward, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I knew we didn't have much time. I managed to get Tom halfway out of the pit when the man spoke. His voice was low, calm, like he was discussing the weather. "You won't make it," he said. Those words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't respond, didn't look at him. I just focused on getting Tom out. My hands were shaking, and I was sure the man could see how terrified I was. But somehow, I managed to pull Tom out of the pit. He was injured, his leg bleeding badly, but we couldn't stop. We had to run. I hauled him to his feet, supporting him as best I could. We stumbled forward, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees like dark sentinels watching our every move. I could hear the man behind us, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like he knew we couldn't escape. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. But the forest was a maze, and I had no idea where we were going. We ran for what felt like an eternity, the man's footsteps always just behind us. I didn't know how much longer we could keep going. Tom was getting weaker, his steps faltering. I knew we had to find help, but there was no one out here, no one to save us. Just as I thought we couldn't go any further, we burst out of the trees and onto a dirt road. I looked around, desperate for any sign of life, but the road was empty. I turned back to the forest, but the man was gone. The only sound was the wind in the trees and our labored breathing. I didn't know if we were safe, if the man had given up, or if he was still out there, watching us. We collapsed on the road, too exhausted to move. I held Tom close, both of us shaking with fear. We made it out of the forest that day, but I don't think I'll ever really escape. Every time I close my eyes, I see the man in the shadows, waiting. And I wonder if, one day, he'll come back for me. I always hated scary stories. They made me feel small and helpless, like a child lost in a dark room. But I never thought they could be real. That changed during a camping trip with my college friends last summer, deep in the woods where no one could hear us scream. It started innocently. We sat around the campfire, the flames crackling and sending sparks into the night sky. The air was cool and the forest around us was strangely quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of the fire and our laughter. The guys, Mark, Tom, and Chris, decided it was the perfect time to share ghost stories. I didn't want to join in, so I just listened, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. Mark went first, telling a story about a time he went camping alone. He claimed he heard footsteps around his tent, slow and heavy, like someone was walking in circles around him. He said he never found out who or what it was, and we all laughed it off as just a creepy tale. But that night, when everyone else had fallen asleep, I heard them too. The same footsteps, dragging in the dirt, moving around our tent. My heart pounded, and I held my breath, too scared to move or wake the others. I convinced myself it was my imagination, that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I was exhausted, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want the guys to think I was scared. That night, Tom told a story about a shadowy figure he had seen watching him from the edge of the woods during a hike. He described it as tall, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to follow him, even when he wasn't looking. Again, we laughed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. When I went to sleep, I tried to tell myself it was just a story, but in the middle of the night I woke up and saw it. A figure standing just beyond the firelight, barely visible, but I knew it was there, watching. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, staring into the darkness, praying for morning. When the sun finally rose, I felt some relief, but I was too tired to enjoy it. I wanted to go home, but I didn't say anything. We still had one more night, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin the trip. That evening, Chris shared his story. He told us about a time he and his brother found strange carvings in the trees near their cabin. Names and dates, some old, some new, but all of them had a sense of something sinister. As he spoke, I noticed how the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. The trees around us felt like they were closing in. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find our names carved into the trees around our campsite. Mark, Tom, Chris, and me. The letters were jagged, like they had been scratched in a hurry, and they were fresh. Panic set in, and I couldn't hide it anymore. I showed the others, hoping they would see reason and we could leave. But they just shrugged it off, saying it was probably some prank by other campers or maybe one of us sleepwalking. But I knew the truth. The stories were coming true, and it was only going to get worse. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I kept seeing things, shadows moving, shapes in the darkness, the figure from the woods standing closer now, almost within reach. I couldn't tell if I was dreaming or awake anymore. Everything felt like a blur, a nightmare I couldn't escape. I tried to wake myself up, but every time I thought I had, I was still there, still trapped in that forest, with the fire dying and the shadows closing in. I lost track of time. The lines between reality and dreams were gone. I didn't know what was real anymore. All I knew was that we were being hunted, played with like toys in some sick game. The others started to see it too, but by then, it was too late. We were trapped. The stories weren't just stories. They were our fate, and we couldn't change it. In the end, I realized there was no waking up because we were never asleep. The nightmare was our new reality, and there was no escape. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of those footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer until they were right behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there, just darkness, and the feeling that I would never see the light again. I don't know how long I've been here. I don't know if I'm still alive or if this is some kind of hell. But if you're reading this, be careful with the stories you tell. You never know which ones might come true. And if they do, you might find yourself trapped, just like me, in a nightmare you can't wake up from. We wanted a peaceful weekend away from the world. Just me and Lisa, surrounded by nature, no phones, no work, no stress. We found a perfect spot deep in the mountains, far from anyone or anything. The air was cool, fresh. The stars above us felt so close, like you could just reach out and touch them. I remember how calm it all seemed when we set up camp. The silence was heavy but comforting, like a thick blanket. That night, we fell asleep easily. The kind of sleep that only comes when you're exhausted but happy. I was woken up by something. I didn't know what at first. Just this sense of unease, like something wasn't right. I nudged Lisa awake, whispering her name. She grumbled, asking what was wrong, and I didn't have an answer. It was still dark outside, not even a hint of morning light, but there was this strange smell, metallic and sharp, that filled the air. Lisa grabbed a flashlight and I unzipped the tent. As soon as I stepped out, my breath caught in my throat. All around our campsite were animal carcasses, fresh and bloody. Deer, rabbits, even a few birds, all laid out in a perfect circle around us. Some were still bleeding, their bodies warm in the cool night air. Lisa stepped out behind me, gasping when she saw the scene. We didn't know what to think. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be just animals. This was too deliberate. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a predator? A bear, maybe? But no, bears don't arrange their kills like this. The way everything was laid out, it felt more like a warning. We decided to pack up immediately. There was no way we were staying another minute. As we hurried to gather our things, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Big, heavy, booted footprints all around the tent. And they weren't there when we went to sleep. Lisa noticed them too. Her face was pale, and I could see the fear in her eyes. I tried to stay calm for both our sakes, but inside, I was panicking. Who had been walking around our tent while we slept? And why leave all these dead animals? We needed to leave, now. We started walking quickly, heading back the way we came. But the forest felt different now. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, like they were watching us. And then we heard it. A low, distant sound, almost like a whistle echoing through the trees. We stopped, listening. It came again, closer this time. And then another sound, this one much clearer. Footsteps, heavy and slow, crunching through the underbrush. We froze, too scared to move. I turned to Lisa, her eyes wide with terror. We both knew we weren't alone. We started moving faster, almost running now. But the footsteps followed, getting closer, more deliberate. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. 3 men, dressed in dirty clothes, holding rifles. They were coming straight for us, no rush, just a calm, steady approach. It was like they knew we had nowhere to go. I grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her with me as we veered off the path and into the thicker part of the forest. The branches scratched at our faces and arms, but we didn't care. We just had to get away. We could hear the men behind us, their voices low, but we couldn't make out the words. They were laughing, enjoying the chase. We ran until our legs burned, stumbling through the darkness. But no matter how fast we went, we couldn't shake the feeling that they were right behind us, playing with us, like cats with a mouse. We tried to stay quiet, but every snap of a twig, every gasp for breath felt too loud. Finally, we saw it, the edge of the forest. The moonlight broke through the trees, and beyond, I could see the faint outline of the road where our car was parked. Relief washed over me, and I started to believe we might actually make it. But then Lisa stopped dead in her tracks, pulling me back. There, just ahead, in a small clearing, was something that made my stomach drop. A pile of animal heads stacked one on top of the other, their eyes staring lifelessly at us. And next to them, a makeshift wooden rack holding more animal parts, legs, antlers, skins. This wasn't just a hunting ground. This was a trophy room, a sick collection of their kills. Lisa was shaking, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what to say, what to do. We couldn't go back. They were behind us. But going forward meant walking right through their hideout. I heard the men again, closer now, their voices clearer. They were arguing about something, but I couldn't make out the words. I whispered to Lisa that we had to keep moving, but she was frozen in place, staring at the pile of heads. I pulled her arm harder this time, and she finally snapped out of it, nodding weakly. We started moving again, trying to stay low, creeping around the edge of the clearing. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. Just as we were about to reach the other side, a voice called out, clear and cold, "Where do you think you're going?" I felt Lisa's grip tighten on my hand, and we broke into a sprint, racing for the road. The sound of gunshots rang out behind us, and I heard a bullet whiz past my ear, so close I could feel the heat of it. We didn't stop running, not until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. We jumped in, and I started the engine, slamming my foot on the gas. The tires spun for a moment in the dirt before catching, and we sped down the road, leaving the forest and those men behind. But even now, back in the safety of our home, I can't shake the feeling that we're still being hunted. They let us go, but I don't know why. Maybe they like the idea of us living in fear, knowing they could find us anytime they want. I haven't told anyone else what happened. Who would believe it? But every night, camping alone was supposed to be peaceful. I needed the quiet after everything that had happened at work, the noise, the endless meetings. The forest was a place where I could be alone with my thoughts, where nothing but the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves would fill my ears. That's what I told myself when I drove up the winding road into the mountains, the trees growing denser with every mile. It was late afternoon when I finally found a good spot, a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. The sun was still up, but the air was already cooling, hinting at the night to come. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and sat down by the small fire I made, trying to let the calmness of the forest settle into my bones. But even as the sky darkened and the fire crackled softly, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was just the newness of it all, being out here alone in the middle of nowhere. I hadn't done this before, camping by myself. It was probably just nerves. Still, the feeling lingered, like eyes on the back of my neck, a slight prickle that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. The woods were quiet, too quiet, but I forced myself to relax, to enjoy the silence. The unease didn't leave, but I managed to push it down. I ate a quick meal, trying to savor the taste, but it felt bland in my mouth. The fire was dying, so I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay down in my sleeping bag. It was cold, colder than I expected. I tugged the bag tighter around me and closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, the wind rustling the leaves, a branch snapping somewhere far away, made me stiffen, my heart racing until I convinced myself it was nothing. Eventually, I drifted off. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, it was sudden, like being jolted out of a dream. My heart was pounding, and for a moment, I didn't know why. Then I felt it, the air, cold and sharp against my skin, much colder than it should be. The tent was open. No, not just open, slashed. The flap was hanging loose, the fabric torn from top to bottom. I lay there, frozen, trying to process what I was seeing, what it meant. Someone had cut open my tent while I was sleeping. Someone had been here right next to me, with a knife. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My hands started to shake, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I forced myself to stay still, to stay quiet, listening for any sound outside. But all I could hear was my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. Whoever did this could still be out there, watching. I needed to get out of there. Slowly, I sat up, trying not to make a sound. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I had to leave, but how? What if they were waiting for me to step outside, to run? I didn't have any choice. I couldn't stay here. I reached for my backpack, hands fumbling as I stuffed things inside. I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus. I just needed to get out of there. Once I had everything, I crept toward the opening, my breath caught in my throat. The night was pitch black, the fire long dead, only the pale light of the moon filtering through the trees. I stepped out, moving slowly, trying to keep my footsteps light. I started walking, every muscle tense, expecting something to happen, but nothing did. The forest was silent, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that made you think something was wrong, that made your mind race with all the things that could be hiding in the dark. I kept walking, faster now, needing to put as much distance between me and that torn tent as possible. Then I felt it, a tug at my ankle, then a sharp pain as I stumbled forward, hitting the ground hard. A wire. I'd tripped over a wire hidden in the leaves. My ankle throbbed, but I didn't have time to worry about it. I pushed myself up, looking around wildly, but I couldn't see anything. Just trees and shadows. But someone had set that trap. Someone was out here, hunting me. I tried to stay calm, but panic was clawing at my chest. I started moving again, limping now, the pain in my ankle growing with each step. The forest seemed to close in around me, every shadow a threat, every sound sending a fresh wave of fear through me. I could feel eyes on me, hear the crunch of leaves behind me. They were following me, getting closer. My mind was racing, thoughts jumbled and confused. Was it just one person or more? Why were they doing this? What did they want? My breaths came in ragged gasps, my throat dry and aching. I couldn't keep going like this, but I had to. I had to get away, find help, find safety. But the forest didn't end. The trees seemed endless, the darkness swallowing me whole. I stumbled again, nearly falling, catching myself just in time. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know if I was even heading in the right direction. My legs were shaking, my body exhausted, but I couldn't stop. Not with them so close. Finally, I saw it, a clearing up ahead. Relief flooded through me, and I pushed myself toward it, hoping, praying that I'd find some sign of civilization, some way out. But when I reached it, there was nothing. Just more trees, the clearing empty, desolate. I collapsed to the ground, my strength gone, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I was lost, and they were still out there. I could hear them now, closer than ever. The soft crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't fight. All I could do was sit there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting. The sound grew louder, the presence almost on top of me. I closed my eyes, every muscle tensed. Then, right behind me, I heard it. The faint snap of a twig, like a footstep in the dark. And then, nothing. Camping alone in the woods is something I've always enjoyed. It's peaceful, away from the noise of the city and the endless notifications on my phone. The idea of spending a night alone under the stars, with nothing but the sounds of nature to keep me company, felt like the perfect escape. This time, I chose a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any hiking trails or other campers. It was just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. The place was exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, secluded, surrounded by tall trees with no sign of human presence. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and soon had a small fire going. As the night grew darker, the sounds of the forest took over. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. These were the sounds that usually calmed me, made me feel connected to the natural world. But this night, something felt different, though I couldn't quite place it. After a simple meal, I crawled into my tent. The air was cool, and the warmth of my sleeping bag quickly lulled me into a light sleep. The sounds of the forest faded into the background, and I felt at peace. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow through the fabric of the tent. Everything was silent. But then I heard it. A soft whisper just outside the tent. It was so quiet I thought I might have imagined it. I lay still, holding my breath, straining to listen. The whisper came again, faint and indistinct, like a breeze carrying a conversation too far away to make out. It seemed to move around the tent, like someone was circling it, speaking in a low voice. My first thought was that it was the wind or an animal brushing against the fabric. I tried to convince myself that's all it was, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. I told myself to ignore it, to go back to sleep. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on my breathing. But every time I started to drift off, I heard it again. It was getting closer, clearer. It didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like words, but I couldn't understand them. My heart began to race. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but the fear was growing, gnawing at me. The whispering continued, and it was no longer just a noise. It was a voice that was trying to say something to me, trying to get my attention. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, urgent. I lay there, frozen, listening as the voice seemed to come from right outside the tent, then from the other side, then closer, like it was circling me, getting tighter. I didn't want to move, but I couldn't stay there, paralyzed by fear. I reached for my flashlight, the small beam of light giving me a sense of security. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, my heart pounding in my ears. I shone the light outside, sweeping it over the trees, the bushes, the ground. There was nothing, just the dark outlines of the trees, the flicker of the dying embers, and the silence that hung heavy in the air. The whispering stopped as soon as I stepped outside. The sudden quiet was almost worse. I stood there, holding the flashlight with shaking hands, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, any sign of what had been making that noise. But there was nothing, only the forest, silent and still. Just as I began to think it was over, that maybe it had all been in my head, I heard it again, the voice. But this time, it was louder, clearer. It came from deeper in the woods, farther away, but more distinct, like it was calling me, telling me to follow. The words were still unclear, but the intent was unmistakable. It wanted me to go into the woods, to leave the safety of my campsite. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to go. I knew it was dangerous, that I should stay by the tent where I had some control. But there was something in that voice, something that made me want to listen, made me want to go towards it. I took a step towards the woods, then another, the light from my flashlight shaking as I moved. But then I stopped, the fear pulling me back. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. The voice grew more insistent, almost angry, as if it knew I was resisting. It was pulling at me, dragging me towards the darkness, and I could feel myself slipping, losing control. But then, in a sudden moment of clarity, I realized what was happening. This was a trap. Someone was out there, trying to lure me into the woods, away from my tent, away from any chance of help. The fear snapped me out of whatever hold the voice had on me. I turned and bolted back to the tent, zipping it up behind me as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat there in the darkness, the flashlight off, trying to calm myself, trying to think. The whispering started again, right outside the tent, angry now, insistent, like it was trying to force its way inside. I clutched my knees to my chest, too scared to move, to even breathe. I didn't know what was out there, who was out there, but I knew I couldn't let them get to me. The whispering continued for what felt like hours, circling the tent, getting louder and closer, but I stayed where I was, refusing to give in. Eventually, as dawn began to break, the voice faded, growing weaker until it was gone. But I knew I wasn't safe. I stayed in that tent until full daylight, until I was sure whoever, whatever it was, had left. When I finally stepped outside, the campsite was just as I had left it, peaceful, quiet, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. I packed up as fast as I could and left the woods, vowing never to camp alone again. To this day, I don't know what I heard that night. I don't know who was out there, trying to lure me into the darkness. But I do know this. I'll never forget that voice, or the terror it brought with it. We were all excited about the trip. The idea was simple: A weekend camping in the desert away from everything. Just me, Dave, Sarah, and Liz. We had been planning it for weeks, looking forward to the silence, the stars, and the break from city life. The drive out was long, the kind where the road stretches straight for miles with nothing but sand and rocks on either side. But we didn't mind. We were looking forward to the peace. Setting up camp was easy. We found a good spot, a flat area surrounded by some boulders that provided a bit of shelter from the wind. The first night was calm. Too calm, actually. No wind, no sounds, just silence, thick and heavy. It was strange, but we laughed it off, joking about how the desert was so dead. Even the wind gave up. But something felt off to me, like the air was holding its breath. The next day was hot, as expected. We spent most of it sitting around, talking, and exploring a bit. When the sun started to set, the air cooled down, and that strange feeling returned. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to ruin the mood. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, and that's when we saw the lights. Faint at first, just a flicker on the horizon, like a star that had fallen too low. We all noticed them at the same time. "Look at that," Dave said, pointing. We watched for a while, expecting them to fade away, but they didn't. They just hovered, distant but there, almost like they were watching us back. "Maybe it's a car," Sarah suggested, but we all knew that didn't make sense. We were in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else around. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out. We grabbed some flashlights and headed toward the lights. But the closer we got, the more they seemed to move away, staying just out of reach. After a while, we gave up and turned back to camp. When we returned, it was as if no time had passed at all, yet the fire had nearly burned out, and the stars had shifted in the sky. Hours must have passed, but it felt like minutes. A strange sense of unease crept over me, but I pushed it aside, blaming it on tiredness. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing things, whispers that seemed to ride the wind, just soft enough to make me question if I was imagining them. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadows and half-seen figures, like something was hovering just out of sight, waiting. The next day was worse. We woke up late, the sun already high, and none of us could remember our alarms going off. We spent the day in a daze. Everything felt out of sync, like we were moving through thick fog. And then, in the afternoon, I noticed a small mark on my arm, just a dot, almost like a needle prick. I didn't remember getting it. When I showed the others, they shrugged it off, saying it was probably a bug bite. But the worry gnawed at me. What if something happened during the night? As the day went on, I realized I wasn't the only one with a mark. Liz had one on her leg, Dave on his neck. Sarah found one on her side. We tried to laugh it off, but the mood was tense. We all felt it now, that sense of being watched, like something was out there, just beyond our sight, observing. By nightfall, the tension was unbearable. We huddled around the fire, trying to ignore the lights that had returned, now closer, brighter. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being studied, like animals in a cage. I felt a sudden urge to look around, and that's when I saw it. A small black device nestled in the rocks, almost invisible. A camera. My heart skipped a beat as I pointed it out to the others. They stared at it, then at each other, but no one moved to touch it. "That's not ours, right?" I asked, my voice shaking. They shook their heads. No one wanted to admit it, but the truth was clear. Someone was watching us. But who? And why? The unease turned into full-blown panic. I could see it in their eyes, even if they didn't want to say it out loud. We decided to leave first thing in the morning. We packed our things quickly, nervously glancing at the lights, which seemed even closer now. As we started packing, the sounds returned, louder this time, almost as if they were inside our heads. The whispers became a low hum, growing louder, pressing in from all sides. It was too much. I felt like my head was splitting open. Everything was too bright, too loud. I couldn't think straight. And then, everything went black. When I came to, the sun was blazing down, and I was alone. The camp was gone. My friends were gone. Just me, lying in the sand, with no idea of how much time had passed. My head throbbed, and my mouth was dry. I tried to piece together what happened, but my memories were fragments, disjointed and surreal. The lights, the sounds, the camera. It all felt like a twisted dream. But the marks on my arm were still there, and the fear in my chest was real. I stumbled to my feet and began walking, but the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. There was no sign of the road, no sign of anything, just endless sand and a sky too blue to be comforting. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Were they taken? Did they leave me behind? Was I even awake? As the day wore on, the questions kept piling up, each one heavier than the last. But the one that weighed the most was this. What really happened out there? Even now, I'm not sure. Maybe it was some sort of experiment. Maybe it was all in my head. Or maybe there's something in the desert that's best left alone. All I know is that I'm not going back. And if you ever find yourself in the desert and you see lights on the horizon, stay away. Some questions are better left unanswered. I planned a quiet weekend alone in the woods. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, so I found this remote campsite far from any towns or highways. When I arrived, the place seemed perfect. Thick trees surrounded me, and there was no one else around. I felt a strange silence, though. No birds, no wind in the leaves, just stillness. It was probably nothing, I told myself. I had to get used to the peace after being around city noise all the time. After setting up my tent, I decided to explore a little. The forest was dense, and the paths were overgrown, but I felt like an adventurer cutting through the underbrush. As I walked, I noticed something strange on the ground. A patch of leaves and branches looked different. It was too flat, too clean, like someone had placed them there on purpose. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started clearing them away. Underneath, I found a trap door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the metal ring. Who would put a trap door in the middle of the forest? I told myself it was probably just an old storage space, or maybe even some forgotten bunker from the war. My curiosity was stronger than my fear, so I opened the trap door. A narrow staircase led down into the darkness. I could barely see the bottom. I almost turned back then, but something pushed me forward. Maybe it was the thrill of discovery, or maybe I just didn't want to feel like a coward. I pulled out my flashlight and started descending the stairs. The air grew colder as I went deeper, and the smell changed, damp, musty, with a hint of something else, something metallic. At the bottom, I found a long, narrow hallway. The walls were made of concrete, cold and rough under my fingertips. My footsteps echoed as I walked, making the space feel even more claustrophobic. I moved forward slowly, shining my flashlight into the darkness ahead. The hallway opened into a larger room, and what I saw made me freeze. There were tables and surgical tools, old and stained with rust. And something darker. The shackles on the walls looked like they hadn't been used in a long time, but the marks left behind told a story of pain. I saw papers scattered across the floor, but I couldn't bring myself to read them. I didn't need to know the details to understand what had happened here. As I moved further into the room, I saw a table in the corner, different from the others. It was cleaner, and there were fresh stains on the floor. My stomach turned as I realized they were blood. This place wasn't just an old, forgotten bunker. Someone had been here recently, doing terrible things. Suddenly, I heard a noise. Footsteps. My heart started racing as I turned off my flashlight and listened. The footsteps were faint but getting closer. Someone was coming down the stairs. Panic hit me hard. I needed to get out, but I couldn't just run for the exit. What if they saw me? What if they were armed? I crept back to the hallway, staying as quiet as possible. The footsteps were louder now, echoing off the walls. I was halfway down the hallway when I heard the trap door creak open. My breath caught in my throat. They were right behind me. I had to get out. But if they caught me? Just as I reached the stairs, I noticed something. The trap door was slightly open. My mind raced. Had they seen it open? Were they waiting for me? I couldn't just walk out. I needed to make sure they weren't there. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, frozen, trying to figure out what to do. I could still hear the footsteps, closer now, almost at the hallway entrance. I had no choice. I had to move. I gripped the flashlight like a weapon and took the stairs two at a time, trying to stay silent but moving as fast as I could. When I reached the top, I pushed the trap door open slowly, praying it wouldn't creak. The night air hit my face, cold and fresh. I peeked out. There was no one there. I didn't wait. I climbed out, closed the trap door as quietly as possible, and started running. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted through the woods. I didn't care about the noise I was making. I just needed to get back to my car. Branches scratched my face and roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going, driven by pure fear. I could hear something behind me, footsteps, breaking branches. They were following me. When I finally reached the campsite, I didn't stop. I grabbed my keys from my pocket and fumbled with the lock, hands shaking. I could feel them getting closer, but I didn't dare look back. I jumped into the car, slammed the door, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness as I sped away, gravel flying behind me. It wasn't until I was on the main road that I dared to look in the rearview mirror. My heart skipped a beat. There was a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, even as I sped away. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I parked under a streetlight and tried to catch my breath. I don't know who they were or what they were doing in that bunker. All I know is that I came too close to finding out, and I'll never go camping alone again. When my partner suggested a family camping trip, I was excited. We hadn't done anything like that in a while, and it seemed like the perfect way to reconnect. The stress of work, kids, and life in general had put a strain on us. So, a few days away, just us and nature sounded ideal. The campsite was deep in the woods, far from other people, which was just what we wanted. No distractions, no phones, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackling of the fire. The kids were thrilled, running around collecting sticks and asking a million questions about the animals we might see. My partner seemed distant, but I didn't think much of it. They'd been under a lot of pressure at work lately, so I just assumed they were tired. We set up the tent and got everything ready. As I started the fire, my partner offered to handle dinner. I remember looking over and seeing them fumble with the knife. It was weird, almost like they didn't want to use it properly. They ended up cutting their hand, a deep slice across the palm. I rushed over to help, but they pulled back, almost like it was nothing. I tried to laugh it off, but something felt wrong. My stomach tightened. It wasn't just the cut, it was the way they looked at me when it happened, like it was part of some plan I wasn't in on. The night crept in fast, the kind that feels like it swallows everything whole. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that made the trees look like they were closing in on us. My partner sat quietly across from me, watching me too closely. I noticed they had packed some strange items, a long coil of rope, extra knives. It didn't make sense for a simple camping trip. I asked about it, and they shrugged it off, saying they brought them just in case. But just in case of what? My instincts were screaming at me, but I pushed the thoughts down. I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe I was just tired too. Maybe I was overthinking everything. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. After dinner, I walked to the edge of the camp to get some air, needing a moment to clear my head. That's when I found it, a small notebook hidden in their bag. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped it open. My blood turned to ice when I read the first page. It was a plan, detailed, cold, and horrifying. It described how I would accidentally fall into the ravine nearby, or maybe suffer a tragic accident with the fire. My hands shook as I read through it, realizing the person I had trusted for years was planning to kill me. I felt the ground disappear beneath me. I couldn't think straight, couldn't breathe. The kids' laughter from the campfire snapped me back to reality. I had to act normal, like I hadn't seen anything. I closed the notebook and put it back carefully, hoping they wouldn't notice it had been moved. I walked back to the camp, forcing a smile, but my mind was racing. I needed to protect myself, to get the kids out of there. But how? As the night deepened, my partner became more insistent that we take a night walk, something we hadn't done in years. I refused, making up an excuse about being tired and wanting to stay with the kids. They didn't push, but I could see the frustration in their eyes, a flash of anger that sent chills down my spine. I pretended not to notice, but I knew they were growing suspicious of my behavior. Later, after the kids had fallen asleep in the tent, my partner started talking about how easy it was for things to go wrong in the wilderness, how people get lost, how accidents happen all the time. Their tone was too casual, too rehearsed, and it confirmed what I already knew. I was in danger, and there was no one out here to help me. Then, they made their move. It happened so fast. One minute, we were sitting by the fire, and the next, they lunged at me, trying to push me toward the edge of the camp where the drop was steep and deadly. I fought back, adrenaline surging through me. I don't know how, but I managed to break free and ran into the darkness of the woods. The branches clawed at my face and arms as I stumbled blindly, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I could hear them crashing through the trees behind me, calling out my name, but there was nothing in their voice but cold determination. They weren't the person I thought I knew. They were a predator, and I was their prey. The chase seemed to go on forever, my lungs burning, legs screaming in pain. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. But the woods were a maze, and I was hopelessly lost. I found a place to hide, crouching behind a thick tree, trying to quiet my breathing. I could hear them nearby, their footsteps slow, deliberate. They were close, too close. Hours might have passed. I can't be sure. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I was left alone in the suffocating silence of the forest. I stayed hidden, too terrified to move, until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. My body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but I had to move. I had to find the kids, to get us all out of there before it was too late. But as I staggered back to the camp, I realized I was still lost. I couldn't find the path, couldn't hear the stream we'd camped near. The forest seemed to close in around me, and for the first time, I wondered if I would ever make it out. I didn't know if they were still out there, hunting me, or if they'd gone back to the camp. All I knew was that I wasn't safe, and I might never be again. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's to get it out of my head. Maybe it's because I need someone to believe me, even if I barely believe it myself. Last weekend, some friends and I decided to go on a hike. We had all been so stressed lately. Work, relationships, you name it. We thought getting out into nature would clear our minds. I guess it did. But not in the way we wanted. The trail we chose was pretty remote, not one of those popular spots with signs everywhere. We wanted quiet, to feel like we were really away from everything. About an hour into the hike, we veered off the main path, just exploring. That's when we saw it. The car was hidden deep in the woods, barely visible under a layer of leaves and dirt. It was old, rusted, and looked like it had been there for years. We were curious, of course. Who wouldn't be? But something about it felt wrong. Really wrong. One of my friends, Jake, brushed away some of the dirt on the window to see inside. He jumped back, swearing under his breath. "There's blood in there," he said, voice shaking. I laughed, thinking he was messing with us. But then I looked inside too. He wasn't kidding. There were clothes, stained dark red and old, and there was a notebook on the front seat. It looked water damaged, but you could still see it had been written in. None of us wanted to open it. Jake was already backing away. We should go, now. But Sarah, another friend, was more curious than scared. She reached for the door handle, and before we could stop her, she opened it. The smell hit us first, something rotting, mixed with metal. The kind of smell that sticks in your throat. There was a metal box on the floor, locked tight. Sarah picked it up, but I told her to leave it. I had this feeling, like something bad would happen if we took anything from that car. We argued about it, but eventually, we all agreed to leave it. The car, the box, the whole damn place. We were freaked out, and it wasn't the adventure we were looking for. As we started to walk back to the trail, I noticed something. At first, I thought it was my imagination. You know when you feel like someone's watching you? That's how it felt. But every time I looked around, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I tried to shake it off, but I wasn't the only one who felt it. Jake kept glancing back too, like he expected to see someone following us. "Do you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered, after we had been walking for a while. We all stopped. There was something, a soft rustling, like leaves being disturbed. But it was steady, matching our movements. It felt like we were being followed. No, not just followed, hunted. We started to walk faster, trying to ignore the fear building up in our chests. But the sounds didn't go away. They got louder, closer. My heart was pounding, and I could see the panic in everyone's eyes. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared out of our minds. The sun was starting to set, and the forest was getting darker. It felt like it was closing in on us. The path back to the trailhead seemed to stretch on forever. And then Jake disappeared. One moment he was right behind me, the next he was gone. We called his name, but there was no answer, just silence. And then that rustling sound again, only now it was all around us. "We need to find him," Sarah said, but her voice was trembling. "We can't leave him out here." We split up, even though every instinct told me not to. I don't know why I agreed. Maybe it was the fear, or maybe I thought we could cover more ground that way. But as soon as I was alone, I regretted it. I wandered through the trees, calling Jake's name, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. The forest was so quiet, too quiet. It was like everything was holding its breath, waiting. Then I heard it, a scream, sharp and terrified, cutting through the silence. It was Jake. I ran towards the sound, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about anything else. When I found him, he was lying on the ground, blood pooling around him. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't think. There was so much blood. And then I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned around, but no one was there. Just the trees, standing silent and dark. I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, blind with fear until I burst out onto the trail. Sarah was there, but she was alone. She looked at me, and I could see the horror in her eyes. "We need to go," she said. And that's all it took. We didn't talk about Jake or what had happened. We just ran as fast as we could until we reached the parking lot where we had started our hike. We drove back to town in silence. No one wanted to say what we were all thinking. No one wanted to admit what we had seen or what had followed us out of those woods. We never called the police. I know we should have, but we were too scared. Scared of what they might find, scared of what we might have to explain. And now, every night, I hear those footsteps in my dreams. I see Jake's eyes staring at nothing, and I know, deep down, that we were never supposed to find that car, and that whoever left it there, they know we did, and they're still out there. Last weekend, I decided to go camping alone. I needed to get away from everything. Just me, the trees, the sky. I wanted to feel free, even if just for one night. So I drove out to this small, quiet spot I know, far from the city. No one else goes there. I thought it would be perfect. It was dark when I set up my tent. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. But I told myself that's what I came here for, to escape the noise. I sat by the fire for a while, thinking about nothing in particular. The warmth of the flames made me feel safe. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep, the sound of the crackling fire fading in my ears. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up suddenly. Something was wrong. I could hear a strange noise, like wood breaking and fire roaring, but louder, closer. I unzipped my tent and looked out, and that's when I saw it. A ring of fire surrounded my campsite. The flames were tall, too tall for a normal campfire. I could see the trees burning, the fire licking up their trunks, closing in on me. Panic hit me like a punch. How did this happen? The fire was too perfect, too even. This wasn't an accident. Someone had set it up. Someone wanted me trapped. I grabbed my water bottle and ran to the edge of the ring, trying to put out the flames, but it was useless. The fire was too strong, too hot. My bottle was empty before it made any difference. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, desperate to find a way out, but there was nothing. Every direction was blocked by fire. Then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, just outside the ring of fire. Fresh, like someone had just been there. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. Someone was out there, watching me. I shouted into the darkness, asking who was there, but no one answered. The only response was the crackling of the flames, growing louder, closer. I needed to get out, and fast. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe, to think. I tried to calm myself, to come up with a plan, but all I could think about was those footprints and the person who made them. Why would someone do this? What did they want? I searched through my gear, looking for anything that could help me escape, but there was nothing. I was trapped, and the fire was closing in. I could feel the heat on my skin, burning even though I was still a few feet away. I started coughing, the smoke filling my lungs, making my eyes water. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to do something. I squinted through the smoke and saw a shadow moving outside the ring of fire. It was a person, standing still, just watching me. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body, dark against the flames. They didn't move, didn't say anything. They just watched. "Why are you doing this?" I yelled, but my voice was weak, hoarse from the smoke. The shadow didn't respond, didn't move. Fear and anger twisted in my chest. Who was this person? Why were they doing this to me? I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The fire was getting too close. I had to get out, even if it meant running through the flames. I covered my face with my jacket, took a deep breath, and ran straight into the fire. The heat was unbearable, like walking into an oven. I could feel my skin burning, my clothes catching fire, but I didn't stop. I pushed through the flames, coughing and screaming, until I finally broke free on the other side. I stumbled into the woods, the cool night air hitting my burned skin like ice. I was free, but I wasn't safe. I could still hear the crackling of the fire behind me, but worse, I could hear footsteps. Someone was following me. I ran faster than I ever have before, my heart pounding, my legs burning. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear them right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, through the trees, the branches scratching at my face, my arms until I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed in a small clearing, my body shaking, my lungs burning. I was too tired to move, too tired to fight. I heard the footsteps stop behind me, and I knew it was over. I turned around, and there they were, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. It was someone I knew, someone I trusted. They stepped into the light, and I saw their face. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I couldn't believe it. Why? Why would they do this to me? They didn't say anything, just looked at me with cold, empty eyes. I wanted to get up, to run, to fight, but I couldn't move. I was too weak, too scared. The person reached into their jacket and pulled out a knife. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. They took a step closer, raising the knife, and everything went dark. That's all I remember. When I woke up, it was morning. The fire was gone. The campsite was destroyed, but I was alive, barely. My skin was burned. My body was bruised, but I was alive. The person was gone, leaving me there alone with nothing but the memory of what happened. I don't know why they did it, or why they left me alive. Maybe it was some sick game. Maybe they wanted me to suffer, to remember what they did. All I know is that I can't stop thinking about it, about the fire, the footsteps, the knife. Every time I close my eyes, I see their face, cold and empty, and I wonder if they're still out there, watching me, waiting. I don't think I'll ever go camping again. We decided to go camping to get away from the city noise, just for a weekend. The idea of being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature, sounded perfect. My partner, Alex, was excited, packing everything meticulously. I tried to match the enthusiasm, but something felt off as we drove deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, the road narrower. By the time we reached the campsite, we were completely isolated. The place was exactly as advertised, remote, quiet, with only the sounds of the wind and the occasional bird breaking the silence. We set up our tent near a small clearing, where the ground was flat and the view was good. The forest stretched endlessly around us, dark and thick, almost swallowing the light of the day. It was peaceful, but too quiet, too still. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything. After setting up camp, we decided to explore the surroundings. The sun was still high and the day was warm. Alex was leading the way, talking about how great it was to be away from everything. I followed, trying to shake off the unease that kept creeping into my thoughts. That's when I saw it. Just a little off the path, something was sticking out of the ground, partially covered by dirt and leaves. I stopped, and Alex noticed, coming back to see what had caught my attention. It was a backpack, an old one with faded colors and frayed edges. But what made my stomach turn was the dark stain on it, red and dried. Blood. Alex and I stared at it for a moment, neither of us saying anything. My mind was racing. Who did this belong to? Why was it buried here? And whose blood was it? Alex suggested we leave it alone, go back to the campsite, but I couldn't. Something about it pulled me in, like I needed to know more, even though I was terrified of what we might find. We dug it out, our hands trembling. Inside there were a few items: a torn jacket, some old snacks, and a water bottle. Everything looked abandoned, like it had been there for a while. But there was nothing to explain the blood, nothing to tell us whose bag it was. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Alex tried to reassure me, saying it was probably nothing, just some old accident. But the fear had already taken hold of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that someone was out there watching us. Back at the campsite, I couldn't relax. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I felt eyes on me, hidden in the trees, just out of sight. Alex tried to comfort me, saying it was just the forest, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But I knew it wasn't just in my head. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, deep in my bones. As the day went on, my paranoia grew. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something emerge from the trees. Alex noticed and suggested we leave early, head back to the car. I agreed immediately. The thought of staying there, with that blood-stained backpack and the silence pressing down on us, was unbearable. We packed up quickly, throwing our things into bags, not caring if we forgot something. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief, thinking we could just drive away and forget all about it. But when Alex turned the key, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't start. Panic set in. We tried everything, turning the key over and over, checking under the hood, but it was no use. We were stuck. My heart was pounding, and the silence of the forest became suffocating. It felt like the trees were closing in, like the shadows were growing longer, reaching out for us. I could feel my breath quickening, my mind racing with thoughts of who might be out there, who had left that backpack. The sun was setting, and with it, our chances of getting out of there. Alex was trying to stay calm, but I could see the fear in their eyes too. We both knew something was wrong, something we couldn't explain. I started to imagine figures moving in the darkness, hidden among the trees, waiting for the night to fall. We were trapped, and the fear was overwhelming. As night fell, we decided to stay in the car, hoping that morning would bring help, or at least a clearer mind. But the darkness only made things worse. Every noise, every shift of the wind made me jump. I kept staring out the windows, trying to see into the blackness, expecting to see someone, or something, standing there, watching us. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was hard to tell. Time seemed to stretch out, every second filled with dread. Alex was trying to sleep, but I couldn't close my eyes. I was too afraid of what might happen if I did. My mind was filled with images of that backpack, of the blood, of the person it might have belonged to. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw it. Footprints, fresh ones, leading away from our car and disappearing into the woods. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. Someone had been here, close enough to touch the car, to watch us. My heart nearly stopped as I realized what it meant. We weren't alone. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. And now, they knew we were trapped. I woke Alex, my voice barely more than a whisper as I pointed out the tracks. We sat there, frozen, not knowing what to do, fear gripping us like a vice. The night seemed to close in around us, and the silence was deafening. We didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, drowning out everything else. The story ends here because I don't know what happened next. We didn't stay to find out. Somehow, by morning, we managed to get the car started and we drove out of there as fast as we could. But I'll never forget those footprints. The feeling of being watched, the knowledge that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond our reach. And I'll never go back to those woods. Ever. We decided to go camping last weekend, away from the noise and people, somewhere deep in the woods where we could find some peace. It was me, Sarah, Jake, and Mike, friends since college. We always talked about getting away from everything, just us and nature. So, we picked a remote area in the mountains, far from any trails or campsites on the map. The drive up was long, the roads becoming narrow and rough, but we liked the feeling of being isolated. We finally reached a spot where we thought we could set up, but while we were searching for a good place to pitch our tents, we stumbled upon an old campsite. It was hidden in a clearing, surrounded by tall trees. At first, we were excited, thinking we had found something cool, maybe an old ranger post or a hunting site. But the closer we got, the more it felt wrong. The tents were still there, but they were decayed, with holes and stains from years of neglect. The fire pit was cold, filled with ashes and charred pieces of wood. Scattered around were some rusty tools, old clothes, and a few moldy books. I picked up one of the books, and when I opened it, I realized it was a journal. The writing was shaky, like the person was scared or in a hurry. They wrote about strange noises at night, something moving between the trees, and the feeling of being watched. The last entry just ended mid-sentence, as if the person had to stop writing suddenly. We should have left right then, but we didn't. Jake thought it was just an old abandoned camp, maybe from some hikers who got lost or gave up. Sarah joked that it was probably just a bear that scared them off. We set up our tents a little further from the old camp, trying to ignore the bad feeling creeping up on us. As the sun went down, the woods around us got darker, faster than I expected. We started a fire, trying to keep the mood light with some stories and jokes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the shadows, but there was nothing there. Jake noticed me being jumpy and asked if I was okay. I shrugged it off, blaming the creepy old camp. But when I looked at the others, I could tell they felt it too. Mike was quieter than usual, and Sarah kept looking at the trees, her smile fading. That night, as we all tried to sleep, I heard it, the sound of branches breaking, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved around our campsite, stopping every now and then, like whoever or whatever it was watching us. I wanted to wake the others, but I was frozen in place, afraid that if I made a sound, it would come closer. Eventually, the noise stopped, and I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, I told the others what I heard, but they brushed it off. Jake said it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But I saw the doubt in his eyes. We spent the day exploring, but I couldn't enjoy it. The whole time, I felt uneasy, like something was following us, just out of sight. As we headed back to our camp, Mike suddenly stopped and pointed into the trees. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice low. We all turned to look, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. Sarah laughed nervously, saying we were all just freaking ourselves out. But Mike wasn't convinced, and neither was I. That night, it happened again. I saw movement between the trees, shadows that didn't seem to match up with the branches. I whispered to Jake, trying to get him to look, but by the time he turned, the shadows were gone. He sighed and told me to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. The next morning, we woke up to find Mike was gone. His tent was empty, his gear still there, but he was nowhere to be found. We called his name, searched the area, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in. Jake tried to stay calm, saying, "Maybe Mike just went for a walk," but I could see he didn't believe it. We argued about what to do: stay and wait for Mike or pack up and leave. Sarah wanted to leave, but Jake insisted we couldn't just abandon Mike. We decided to split up and search the area again, but the further we went from the camp, the more lost we felt. The trees all looked the same, and the paths seemed to twist and turn back on themselves. It was like the forest was trying to keep us there. By the time we returned to the campsite, the sun was already setting. Mike was still missing, and now Jake was starting to doubt everything too. Sarah was scared, crying quietly as she packed up her things. She begged us to leave, but Jake wanted to try one more search in the morning. That night was the worst. The sounds came back, louder this time. Footsteps, whispers, the creak of branches under heavy weight. I could see shadows moving closer to our tents, and I knew then that it wasn't just animals or my imagination. Something was out there, watching us, hunting us. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and ran, not caring where I was going, just wanting to get away. I heard Jake and Sarah calling after me, but their voices faded as I crashed through the woods, branches scratching my face and tearing at my clothes. The forest seemed endless, every direction the same, dark and oppressive. I didn't know how long I ran before I tripped and fell, my body giving out. I lay there, panting, listening. At first, there was nothing, just my own breathing. Then, I heard it. Footsteps, getting closer, slow and deliberate, like they were in no hurry because they knew I had nowhere to go. I wanted to get up, to run again, but I couldn't move. All I could do was lie there, waiting, as the footsteps came closer, and the darkness closed in around me. We planned the trip for weeks. A small camping getaway in the woods with our 2 kids, Emma and Lucas, seemed like the perfect way to disconnect. My wife, Sarah, was excited about getting them away from screens and into nature. I was too. But now, as I sit here, I wonder how I could have missed the signs. The campsite was deep in the forest, far from the noise of the city. We set up our tents in a clearing surrounded by tall trees. The kids were thrilled, running around, exploring the area. The air was fresh, the kind that makes you take deep breaths and feel alive. It felt perfect, too perfect, maybe. That first night, after dinner by the campfire, we settled in. The kids were in their small tent, right next to ours. I remember hearing the wind rustling the leaves and the crackling of the dying fire as I drifted off to sleep. Then, there was a noise. It was distant, almost like a whisper. I told myself it was just animals in the woods, but it felt wrong, a bit too close, a bit too deliberate. I didn't mention it to Sarah. She was already asleep, and I didn't want to worry her. Morning came, and with it, the realization that something was horribly wrong. The kids' tent was empty. At first, I thought maybe they had woken up early and gone exploring. But as we called their names and got no answer, panic started to rise. Sarah's voice cracked as she shouted for them. I kept telling myself they were just playing a game, hiding somewhere, but deep down, I knew. We found small footprints leading away from the campsite, mixed with another set, smaller and lighter, that didn't belong to any of us. My heart pounded as we followed them, deeper into the woods. The trail led us to places where the undergrowth was thick, where no one should be walking. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in around us. Sarah and I decided to split up, thinking we could cover more ground. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made my heart race. I called out their names, my voice growing hoarse, but there was nothing. just the sounds of the forest, indifferent to our fear. It was then that I found the first sign. A piece of Emma's pink jacket, torn and hanging from a branch. My hands shook as I reached for it. I tried to tell myself it wasn't hers, but I knew. I clutched it tightly and kept moving, faster now, almost running. Then I saw them, small drawings scratched into the dirt. They were childlike, simple. Emma loved to draw, and I could see her hand in those lines, shaky but determined. The forest grew even denser as I pushed forward, the light barely breaking through the thick canopy. That's when I saw the cabin. It was old, hidden deep in the woods, almost like it didn't want to be found. The windows were broken, the wood rotting, but the door was slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of damp wood and decay. The floor creaked under my weight. On a small, dusty table, I found more drawings, Emma's for sure, and one of Lucas's toys, a little car, sitting next to them. My knees buckled, and I felt a wave of nausea. Someone had been here, watching us, waiting. I searched the cabin, but there was no sign of the kids, just more evidence that they had been taken. The fear that had been gnawing at me since morning now fully consumed me. I stumbled out of the cabin, desperate to find Sarah, to tell her what I'd found. I ran through the woods, shouting for her, my voice cracking with every call. When I finally found her, she was kneeling by the river, clutching a piece of Lucas's shirt. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up at me, and I knew she had found something too. We didn't need words to understand the terror that gripped both of us. As we stood there, trying to figure out our next move, we heard it, a faint cry, distant but unmistakable. It was Emma's voice, calling for us. But something about it was off, like it was echoing through the trees in a way that didn't seem natural. We looked at each other, not knowing whether to run towards it or away from it. The cry came again, this time from another direction, then another, like it was moving around us. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Sarah gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and whispered, "What do we do?" Her voice was trembling, just like mine. We were paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Going after the voices could be a trap, but staying put meant we might never see our kids again. The weight of the decision was crushing. I looked into the woods, where the cries seemed to come from, and then back at the cabin, where we had found the first clues. In the end, we decided to follow the voices. It felt like our only chance, even if it was a slim one. As we moved deeper into the woods, the cries grew louder, more desperate. But there was something else too. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, following us, surrounding us. I don't know how this will end. I don't know if we'll find Emma and Lucas, or if we'll be lost here forever. All I know is that every step we take feels like it could be our last. And the deeper we go, the more I'm convinced that someone or something is leading us into a trap. And yet we keep moving forward, because what else can we do? I always liked the idea of camping. The thought of disconnecting from everything, no phone, no work, just nature, seemed like the perfect escape. My friend James agreed. So, we decided to spend a weekend in a remote area known for its beautiful scenery. I didn't know then that I would never want to camp again after that trip. We arrived at the campsite early in the afternoon. It was just as beautiful as we had imagined. Tall trees surrounded us, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. A small river flowed nearby, its sound calming and peaceful. We set up our tent in a small clearing, joking about how we were going to have the best weekend ever. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I tried not to think too much about it. We were far from any city, and that was the whole point, right? As the sun began to set, we started a fire and sat around it, talking about life. We laughed, shared stories, and talked about all the things we wanted to do. It was one of those moments where everything felt perfect. But as the night grew darker, the feeling of unease that I had ignored earlier started to creep back in. It started with a rustling sound in the bushes behind us. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a small animal. James didn't seem to notice at first, but then the noises grew louder. We both paused, listening. There was a moment of silence, then we heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. We exchanged nervous glances, trying to laugh it off. Probably just a deer or something, James said, but I could hear the tension in his voice. The sounds didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to be getting closer. The footsteps turned into heavy breathing, the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We froze, listening to branches snapping and something dragging across the ground. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure James could hear it. "What do you think it is?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. James shook his head, his face pale in the firelight. "I don't know, man. Maybe we should just stay in the tent. Whatever it is, it'll probably go away if we don't bother it." We crawled into the tent, zipping it up quickly as if that thin layer of fabric could protect us from whatever was out there. We lay there in silence, the only sound now being our own breathing. I tried to convince myself that it was just animals, that we were overreacting, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but when I woke up, the tent felt colder, and something was different. I reached over to where James should have been, but my hand touched only an empty sleeping bag. Panic surged through me as I sat up, frantically looking around. "James?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I unzipped the tent and stumbled outside, my heart racing. The campfire had long died out, leaving the area in almost complete darkness. I called his name again, louder this time, but there was nothing. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves, like whispers in the night. I searched the area around the tent, my fear growing with every step. There were signs of a struggle, footprints, broken branches, and something that looked like drag marks leading away from the campsite. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Did someone take him? Was he hurt? The questions swirled around in my head, but I had no answers. Then I heard it again, that same dragging sound, but this time it was behind me. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping, but there was nothing there, just the darkness and my own fear. I was alone, and something was out there with me. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and started following the tracks, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I didn't know what else to do. I had to find James. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, the trees twisting into shadows that looked like figures watching from the darkness. Every few steps I would hear something, a snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, a faint whisper of movement. I would stop, shine the flashlight around, but I never saw anything. The fear was paralyzing, but I couldn't stop. Not until I found James. After what felt like hours, I came to a small clearing. The tracks led here, but then they stopped, like whoever or whatever was dragging James had just vanished. I stood there, turning in circles, trying to see anything in the faint beam of my flashlight. But there was nothing. That's when I felt it. A presence behind me, so close I could feel the warmth of breath on the back of my neck. I turned around slowly, my heart in my throat, but again, there was nothing, just empty air. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. I don't remember much after that. I must have run, my fear driving me to move faster than I ever thought possible. The trees blurred past me as I stumbled through the forest, my only goal to get away, to survive. The noises followed me, growing louder, closer, until I felt like I could reach out and touch whatever was chasing me. I don't know how long I ran before I tripped over something and fell hard to the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand, rolling away into the darkness. I lay there, too terrified to move, waiting for whatever was behind me to catch up. But nothing happened. The forest was silent again, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But as I pushed myself up, I heard it one last time. The dragging sound, so close I could feel it in my bones. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The story ends here because I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that when I woke up, it was daylight, and I was alone. James was never found, and I will never go camping again. The Watcher in the Trees. I was tired of everything: work, people, the endless noise of the city. I needed to get away, to be alone for a while, just me and the silence of the woods. That's how I ended up at a remote campsite, far from civilization. It was perfect, quiet, peaceful, with nothing but trees and the sounds of nature around me. But from the moment I arrived, there was a feeling I couldn't shake off, like something was slightly off. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just nerves from being alone, but it lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. After setting up my tent, I went to gather firewood. As I walked through the trees, something caught my eye, a small glint from one of the branches. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I got closer, I realized it was a camera. A small hidden camera pointed directly at my campsite. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Who would put a camera here? Maybe it was some old security measure, I told myself. Maybe the forest rangers had set it up to monitor wildlife. But it didn't make sense. The camera was too well hidden, almost as if someone didn't want it to be found. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I tried to shrug it off and continued gathering firewood, but the unease only grew stronger. After an hour, I found myself wandering further away from the camp, scanning the trees, searching for more cameras. And I found them. 3 more, all hidden in different spots, all pointing at my campsite. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been watching me, maybe even since I arrived. My breath quickened as I turned in a circle, looking at the trees, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. I was not alone out here, not really. Someone was out there, watching my every move. I rushed back to the campsite, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just some prank, I thought. Maybe the cameras were left by a previous camper who was playing a joke. But when I got back to my tent, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small memory card lying on the ground, right next to one of the trees where I had found a camera. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what was on it. I grabbed my laptop from the tent, plugged in the card, and opened the files. What I saw made my stomach churn. There were videos, dozens of them, of me. Me setting up my tent, me gathering wood, me sitting by the fire. Every move I had made since arriving was captured in clear detail. The worst part? The timestamps. The latest video was recorded just an hour ago, right before I found the card. Panic set in. Whoever was watching me was close, very close. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I had to get out of there. I started packing up my things in a frenzy, throwing everything into my backpack without caring if it fit or not. I just wanted to leave. But when I got to my car, I found that my tires had been slashed and the engine wouldn't start. Someone had made sure I couldn't leave. I was trapped, with no cell service, no way to call for help. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, suffocating. I could almost feel the eyes on me, the rustling in the trees around me growing louder, more deliberate. Desperate, I grabbed the only weapon I had, a small camping knife. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I couldn't just sit and wait for whatever was out there to come for me. I had to do something, anything. I stood in the middle of the campsite, knife in hand, and shouted into the darkness, "Come out! I know you're there. Show yourself." The forest was silent for a moment, the only sound my own heavy breathing. Then, from behind me, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming closer and closer. I turned around, knife raised, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was no one there, just the darkness of the trees. The footsteps continued, circling around me, always just out of sight. I felt like I was being toyed with, like whoever was out there was enjoying this, dragging out the fear as long as possible. I wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The footsteps were getting closer, closing in on me. I spun around, trying to catch a glimpse of my stalker, but all I saw were shadows. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, worse than the sound of the steps. I held my breath, waiting, every muscle in my body tense. But nothing happened. No one appeared. The forest was still, the only sound the distant call of an owl. I stood there, knife in hand, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I stay and wait, or should I try to make a run for it? Before I could decide, I heard it again, the footsteps, this time right behind me. I turned around, but it was too late. The last thing I remember was a sharp pain in the back of my head, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground, my head throbbing. My knife was gone, and the campsite was empty, just as I had left it. But the feeling of being watched was still there, stronger than ever. I knew I had to get out, but I had no idea how. As I stumbled to my feet, I heard the footsteps again, this time approaching from the front. I turned to face them, but the last thing I saw was a shadow moving quickly toward me. And then, nothing. I don't know how long I've been out here, wandering through the trees, trying to find a way out. I feel like I'm being hunted, but I don't know by who or why. All I know is that I'm not alone in these woods, and I might never leave them. As I set out for my usual solo hike in the dense, remote woods that afternoon, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth, and my footsteps were the only sound echoing through the trees. But as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows on my path, I stumbled upon something that sent a chill down my spine. An abandoned campsite. It looked as if the people who had been there left in a panic. A tent was partially collapsed, its fabric flapping weakly in the breeze. Backpacks were thrown about, some spilling their contents onto the damp ground. A cold, unfinished meal sat on a makeshift table, and most disturbingly, there were signs of a struggle. Scratches in the dirt, a broken lantern. The eerie silence that hung over the scene made it clear. Something bad had happened here. Deciding to camp nearby might have been a mistake, but as night fell, the idea of continuing through the dark forest seemed even worse. I set up my tent with shaky hands, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig setting my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or a small animal moving in the underbrush. But as the darkness deepened, so did my unease. That's when I saw it for the first time. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitted between the trees. I turned sharply, peering into the darkness, but it was gone. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer came, only the sound of my own voice echoing off the trees, sounding small and frightened. I retreated to my tent, zipping the entrance tightly. But sleep eluded me. Every noise seemed magnified, and twice more I saw the shadow, each time closer than the last. By the time morning light filtered through the trees, I was wrought with fear, convinced I was being watched or hunted. I knew I had to leave. Packing only the essentials, I planned my escape, choosing a path I knew well that would lead me back to civilization. The hike was treacherous in the dim morning light, every shadow a potential hiding spot for my stalker. I moved as quickly as I could, but the feeling of being followed never left me. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was out there knew exactly where I was going. Then, the confrontation I'd been dreading. As I rounded a bend, I came face to face with a figure standing in the middle of the path. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, disheveled, his clothes torn and his eyes wild with fear. He was one of the campers, he explained quickly, his voice trembling. Their group had been attacked by someone, a man unhinged and violent. They had scattered, lost in the night. He thought I was the attacker returning to finish the job. Relief flooded through me, mingled with a new wave of fear. We were not alone. The attacker might still be out there. Together, we hurried toward safety, the forest seeming to watch us with 1,000 eyes as we made our way to an outpost by dawn. Sitting there, in the safety of civilization, sipping on a hot cup of coffee, I reflected on the night's horrors, the fragility of the human mind, the thin line between being the hunter and the hunted, and the chilling reality of what humans are capable of under stress. As I looked back towards the dark silhouette of the forest, I couldn't help but wonder what else was still out there, lurking in the depths, waiting for its next victim. We thought it would be funny. That's how it all started. A camping trip in the woods, just a group of old friends trying to relive our high school days. We joked, drank too much, and then someone, I can't even remember who, had the brilliant idea. "Let's scare Nick," they said. "Let's make him think there's a killer out here." Nick was always the jumpy one, easy to scare, and the rest of us, we loved messing with him. So, we all agreed. The plan was simple. Fake blood, some screams in the dark, and a few of us hiding in the trees to make creepy noises. We even carved a fake threat into a tree, something cheesy like, "I'm watching you." It was supposed to be all in good fun. At first, everything went exactly as we planned. Nick fell for it hard. His face turned pale when he saw the fake blood on the tent. He started freaking out, asking if we heard the noises in the woods. We laughed behind his back, trying to keep it quiet so he wouldn't catch on. But then, something happened that wasn't part of our prank. We were all gathered around the campfire, watching Nick's every reaction, when Mark noticed something strange. "Hey," he whispered to us, "I didn't carve that." We all looked at the tree where Nick had found the threat earlier, but there was another message now, freshly carved and deeper than ours. "You shouldn't have come here." For a second, we all froze. No one was laughing anymore. Mark swore he hadn't done it, and I believed him. The cut marks looked too clean, too precise, not like the sloppy joke we made earlier. We tried to laugh it off, pretend it was still part of the prank, but the mood had shifted. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on us, watching us. That's when we started hearing the noises. At first, it was just rustling in the bushes. Probably a raccoon, we thought, or maybe a deer. But then the sounds got closer. Footsteps, snapping twigs, and something else, like a faint, distant laugh. We looked at each other, our nervous smiles fading. "Who's out there?" someone whispered, but no one answered. We tried to keep our cool, pretending it was still a joke, but deep down, we all knew something wasn't right. Then, the shadows started moving. I saw it first, a figure darting between the trees, just at the edge of the firelight. I thought it was one of us playing a trick, but when I did a quick head count, everyone was there. Everyone except Nick. "Nick, quit messing around," I shouted into the dark, trying to sound brave, but my voice cracked. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer, slowly, deliberately, like it wanted to be seen but not too clearly. My heart was pounding now, and I wasn't the only one. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes, the realization that we might not be alone out here. We decided to leave. It was supposed to be easy, just pack up and drive back to town. But when we got to the cars, the tires were slashed, every single one. And our phones? Gone. We searched everywhere, but they were just gone, like someone had taken them while we were busy scaring Nick. Panic set in. We started arguing, blaming each other. "This isn't funny anymore," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Who the hell is doing this?" No one had an answer. We were all too scared to admit what we were really thinking, that someone was out there, and it wasn't one of us. We tried to stick together, but the fear was too strong. People started turning on each other. Mark accused Dave, said he saw him sneaking around earlier. Dave shot back that Mark had been acting weird all night, disappearing into the woods for long stretches. I tried to calm everyone down, but I could feel the doubt creeping in too. What if one of us was behind this? What if the prank had taken on a life of its own? That night was the longest of my life. We huddled together by the dying fire, too scared to sleep, too scared to talk. Every little sound made us jump, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadowy figure, lurking just out of reach. The tension was unbearable, like a rubber band stretched too tight, ready to snap. By morning, we were all wrecked, exhausted, paranoid, and desperate to leave. But the cars were still useless, and there was no sign of Nick. We decided to split up. Half would stay at the camp in case Nick came back, and the rest of us would try to hike out and find help. I was in the group that stayed behind. We waited for hours, but Nick never showed. Just as we were about to give up, I heard something rustling in the bushes again. My stomach dropped. "Nick?" I called out, but deep down, I knew it wasn't him. The shadowy figure emerged, and this time, it didn't hide. It was Nick, or at least, it looked like him, but there was something wrong. His eyes were wild, his clothes torn and dirty. He had something in his hand, a knife, stained dark red. "I didn't do it," he muttered over and over, more to himself than to us. "I didn't do it." We didn't have time to ask what he meant. He lunged at Mark, and that's when all hell broke loose. We scattered, running in different directions, screaming for help that wasn't coming. I don't know how I got away, but I kept running, even after the screams had stopped, even after I couldn't hear anything but my own ragged breathing. I don't know who survived, or if they even found our bodies. All I know is that something snapped in Nick that night, or maybe it was always there, hiding beneath the surface. I've tried to forget, tried to move on, but every time I close my eyes, I see that figure in the woods, hear those footsteps behind me. I'm still running, even now, because I know he's still out there.